So next slide, please. Okay, so there's two different types of divorces. And some of you may have heard this. There's no fault divorce and fault divorce. And then under the no fault divorce, there's two types of no fault divorce. The easiest and smoothest way to resolve or to become divorced is a consent divorce. If you and the other spouse agree, you have to file the paperwork in court. Then there's a required 90-day waiting period. I think maybe, Lisa, that's in case people change their mind.
You're exactly right, Sandy. It's just to give them a period of time so that they can just reevaluate what it is that they want to do, because there are often times where people start out wanting to get a divorce, but then they decide along the way that maybe they can reconcile. So that's exactly what it's for.
Wonderful. And that makes sense. You know, you have a big fight. The next morning you file for divorce. You don't want it to happen right away. You might want to wait a little bit. And if the other person receives, you have to serve the other person. And if they receive it and they sign a piece of paper, then after that 90-day waiting period, then your divorce will be final. The other one is, okay, say the other spouse does not want to sign the consent. You can wait 1 year. Used to be 2, I think, but now it's only 1 year. You can wait 1 year, and then you have to still serve or give the other person a copy of the paperwork. But after you've been separated for 1 year, I believe, again, the court assumes, hey, you've been separated, you guys aren't getting along, the bond is broken or irrevocably broken. Is that the word, Lisa? I forgot the fancy word.
Irretrievably broken.
I knew it started with ER, RE something. Okay, so that next, and the only type of divorces I've ever done are no fault divorces. I mostly work with low income folks, so I'm not very familiar with other types of divorces. There are fault divorces, and as the PowerPoint mentions, it's a more detailed process. So it's going to be more expensive in terms of how much time an attorney might spend. One of the types of fault divorces is if the other spouse is institutionalized or in a mental health hospital for 18 months and is expected to stay there. So that's just, I thought, interesting. All right, next slide.
Okay. And one of the things before you proceed, Sandy, that I just want to mention is that even when you're thinking about whether it's a fault or no fault divorce, when it comes to the complexity of it, typically your divorces that are going to be the easiest and the least expensive are going to be the ones where both parties agree. It's going to be the ones where both parties agree. Also, they're going to be easier when you don't have any type of assets that have to be split up. So you're talking 2 people that maybe got married, they don't really own much or anything at all. They don't have a lot of joint assets. They don't have any additional property, things of that nature. That is going to make the process easier, less expensive. And then if they also agree, it makes it much faster just to go through that process. When you start getting into the more complicated divorces where, you've been married for a long time, so you've accumulated a lot of stuff, right? Because we get married and we get all this stuff together, whether it's debts, it's credit cards, we purchase things together, we have homes, houses, bank accounts, then that's when you really start making the process much more complicated because it requires a lot more energy and effort to do those things. So I know we'll talk a little bit more further down as it relates to kind of equitable distribution and things like that, but I just wanted to clarify that.
Excellent, excellent point. And I should go back. The topic of this discussion actually is divorce. Why is breaking up so hard to do? Because there is a process, and adding that 90-day waiting period, and then there's also another 30 days, you got a deadline. So it is a difficult process, and we are trying to outline it for you. And that's why I mentioned why is breaking up so hard to do it, because it's not as easy as you might think. So the next slide is how to file for a divorce. And for no fault divorces, either both parties agree or there's been a 1-year separation of the parties. For either of those two no fault divorces, in Dauphin County, for example, you can use our courthouse self-help center to print out or go to the courthouse and purchase the forms and instructions to file for either of these types of no fault divorces. And you'll get, 20 pages of detailed forms and instructions, but we're just outlining this. So first of all, you want to know if you can file in your state or your county for divorce. And so you have to have lived there for at least 6 months. And if you haven't, then you may want to file in the state you were before. And the next is step 2 is to state your grounds for divorce. Again, if you file a no fault mutual consent divorce, both parties agree, that's one of the easier ones to do. You also, if that doesn't work, then you have to prove that the marriage is irretrievably broken. And as we mentioned, by being separated for a year, that the court assumes is irretrievably broken. Then the third type is you can file for a fault divorce, and there's listed a few here, but again, I'm not as familiar with the fault divorces. Lisa, is your sense that those are very popular or people try to avoid them?
Well, it's hard to say whether people try to avoid them or not, because it really just depends on the population in which you tend to work with or serve. There are probably just as many as fault as no fault divorces. Okay. I think certainly to the extent that people can avoid, just the additional expense, they try to do so, that's where it comes into play, where you try to do any type of negotiations ahead of time, try to reach settlement agreements ahead of time, particularly if you're talking about distribution of property or assets. If you try to come up with agreements ahead of time, it really does make it go a lot smoother in the process.
Right. And the next step 3 is the self-help paperwork I mentioned is available. Almost every county has those available, as well as a statewide resource. So you can get the forms yourself for no fault. And regardless of the type of divorce, you have to serve or give the information to the other person. And this, I think, is the most difficult part for the folks that I deal with, who are mostly lower income, because you may have, maybe you haven't seen your spouse for 8 years. You left in Vegas and haven't seen him or her for 8 years. You still have to tell them that you're getting divorced. You can't do it without them knowing about it. So it is a rule in our kind of court system. Part of due process, as a fundamental rule we have in our system, is that you have to tell the other person, and you can't do something in a court without telling the other people involved. So you do have to make sure you have an address and a way to serve or give the papers to the other person. You can, sometimes that's certified mail, but some people ignore certified mail. They don't want to go to the post office and pick it up because they know what it is and they don't want to be divorced, or they're afraid of what it is. So it's not, for me, a lot of our volunteer attorneys have a hard time serving the other person.
And I will just say that you can, as Sandy said, you can try if you're on friendly terms, with your spouse, to just send them the paperwork and let them know it's coming, right? But even if you do that, it could just be possible that they won't receive it for a number of reasons. I had a case recently where the other party just did not receive the paperwork because the mail was just really messed up. It was backed up. They never received it. So, there are circumstances where that happens. But the other way is you can have a sheriff actually deliver it, but you can also hire a company there are companies that will do this, and they are process servers, and they will go to the individual's home and or workplace. They will gather information from you so that they can figure out the best times and the best days to identify that individual so that proper service can occur. There's also a process. If you have done everything that you possibly can and you cannot locate the person, you can actually file a petition with the court to actually advertise, to actually do service of process by publication. But it does require you to actually submit a petition to the court. And in that, you must detail all of the steps that you have taken to show that you're not just asking to do this to get a divorce quickly, but that you have actually done all of the things you needed to do to try to find this person. This would include, maybe contacting some of their relatives. So if you know and you were close to the family, you can't say, well, yes, I still see, his mother all the time, but I never bothered to ask his mother where he was or where she was. So you have to be able to detail out that you've taken those steps. And then in the petition it's filed, and if the order is granted by the court, then you can actually publicize it in actual newspaper. And there are specific requirements as to how you do that. Is typically done in some sort of legal paper, and it has to be run for a specified period of time. And it has to identify particular things within the language so that the individual knows what it is they need to do in order to respond.
Great, great, excellent. And there's no questions in the chat, so I don't know if everyone's sleeping out there, but if you have questions, please do type them in the chat. There's also, if your spouse agrees to the divorce and any requests that you have in the divorce, which you can add onto your petition, then the rest of the process is a matter of waiting for the courts to finalize the request. However, if the other party doesn't agree, then you begin negotiations. There might be a divorce master hearing. There might be a trial before a judge. That's pretty unusual, but the more complicated, and as Lisa mentioned, the private investigators, they don't do their work for free. And advertising, most places you have to pay to advertise. So all the complications make it more and more difficult. So I agree with Lisa. I mean, the best thing to do is talk to your spouse and say, listen, I'm going to file a divorce. We can both save a lot of money if we just agree and blah, blah, talk it out. No point in racking up huge legal bills. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a good little outline. You have to know what kind of divorce you're going to be doing. And the no-fault divorce is kind of on the left-hand side. You file a complaint, wait the 90 days. You have to, and serve the other party, of course. And then each person signs the consent. And so it's just processing paperwork back and forth. So for regular, and again, most of the ones I work with, we only do no-fault divorces. So they're paperwork. You're never going to actually, you might not ever go to the courthouse other than to drop off paperwork. The second part on the right-hand side involves if it's a more complicated situation. I suppose it's possible, but I would not try to do a fault-based divorce on your own. And I think it would be very difficult.
I wouldn't recommend it, because you definitely want to make sure that you are not inadvertently giving up any of your rights or anything that you will be entitled to by attempting to do it on your own. Because as I said previously, when you have this type of process, it can be very complex depending on the individual circumstance. Because let's just say, you've been married to someone for 20 plus years and now you're getting a divorce. And think of, in a 20-year time period, how much you may have accumulated. It doesn't account for maybe what you came into the marriage with, but how much have you accumulated and what have you done with those things, and also, you know, how much you're currently making, and just having to go through all of that information, because in this type of divorce, you're going to have just a discovery period where you're just taking time to try to figure out for your client what all exists as it relates to any type of marital property, which would be any of the property that would have been acquired since the time of marriage, so that you can properly assess, you know, the values, how much it's worth, you know, what was there any property that increased during that time? Did you use any premarital money to purchase property during the marriage? And then does that become marital property at that point? Or do you only consider, you know, the actual increase in value? So there's a lot of things that has to be done. Sometimes, depending on the size of the estate that you're talking about, your attorney may also decide to hire additional individuals, other professionals to help you. You know, you may need, depending on the size of the estate, an actuarial person to help you really dig into the numbers. You may bring in an accountant. You know, you may look at just evaluators. So it can really be costly and quite complex. So I would highly recommend for this type of divorce that you would seek professional counsel.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And I think we can move to the next slide. Okay. This question, what to do if your spouse files for the divorce? And the first bullet point is really important. If you receive divorce paperwork, do not just ignore it. Because if you just ignore it, you could be giving up some of your rights, like Lisa said. Now, it could be, you know, maybe one of you was in the military service and there's some special pension or funding or benefit. You really don't know. And you know what really gets to me, Lisa, is I still have people calling me on lawyer referral service who don't know what their assets are. Don't, you know, and one or the other of the spouse is not involved in the financial management. And, you know, I really do not like hearing that, because you both should be involved in understanding your finances.
That happens quite a bit, Sandy. It happens more often in cases where you find that one spouse was a homemaker and the other spouse was really responsible for taking care of all of the household needs and everything. Oftentimes that's when you find it, and that particular spouse who was a homemaker doesn't have any sense whatsoever as to, you know, even how much income is coming into the house, what the bills are like. You know, they may be aware of some additional assets, but in some instances, I've seen where they don't even know that there may have been other assets that were purchased during the marital, just during the marital process. So I agree that is something that's very important for people to discuss in general.
And it's probably a good tip in general. If you get something from a courthouse or something legal in the mail, you should probably open it and look at it, because these kind of things tend not to just disappear on their own. And I know sometimes when we're going through a crisis, we just want to, you know, toss the mail in the pile along with all the bills you can't pay or other problems in the world. But you really do need to pay attention. And the first thing you should do is contact an attorney. Now, if you are low income, you can contact your community legal services in your county. Every county has a legal aid office. Now, one thing people don't realize is not everyone is eligible for free help. Unfortunately, MidPenn Legal Services and other legal aid offices don't have enough charitable donations to help everyone with every type of issue. So you may be going through a divorce and you may have no money, but sometimes you're not going to be able to get a free lawyer. So the other thing, we do our best, and MidPenn tries to help as many people as they can with their very limited budget. If MidPenn can't help you, the next step might be to contact your local lawyer referral. In Dauphin County, I am the staff person who actually takes those calls, talks to people. A lot of it is online now, so there is a link there for you to be able to find our online form. And I email you back with the name and number of an attorney. Again, like Lisa, one of our members here in the Harrisburg area, who you can talk to. And you don't have to hire the first attorney you speak with, but you might want to talk to a couple, because divorce and some other, you know, it's a personal matter. And if you're not comfortable with that person, you might want to, you know, look into someone else. It's also strongly recommended, again, as we both said a few times, to talk to the other person and try to reduce the areas of dispute as much as possible. I usually say it's not worth arguing about the vinyl couch in the basement. You know, it really doesn't matter who ends up with that vinyl couch. You guys didn't like it to begin with, but you're so mad at each other that you just, you know, and every time you do that, it makes it more and more expensive, because attorneys bill. They, you know, when you call a plumber, you have to pay for the time they come out. Attorneys bill for their time. So if you want to argue about your vinyl couch, it's going to cost you some money. And, you know, like I said, most cases should be able to resolve without a full divorce trial. You might, with a fault-based divorce, you might go to a divorce master, but sometimes you're just going to be processing the paperwork. Next slide, please. I really like this graphic that Jalen and Kirsten found, because it kind of goes through the flow chart. So the divorce procedures, if everything went smoothly, you could be done with it in about 3 months. But that's only in the, you know, never would it happen that you'd be done in exactly 90 days. But the 90-day, you know, waiting period really adds to the whole process, right? So your whole process is going to be more than 3 months. And you need to be patient. So if you call your lawyer every day and say, isn't it filed yet? Isn't it filed? It's not going to really help anything, I don't think.
It doesn't, and that's never good, Sandy. We will answer and we will take your call. But as Sandy said, it is expensive because you are being billed for all of that time. The other thing I'll say is, yes, this graphic is helpful as well. It's important to note that timelines are very, very important, and they are strictly adhered to. So throughout this process, there are different rules surrounding the particular paperwork that you have to submit at any given time. And if you miss that, then you may have to start over, begin that step completely over from the beginning, which you don't want to do. So it is important that you do follow through and follow up with your attorney if they want you to come in to sign paperwork, if they mail you something that you need to sign, because most of the things that are required in this process are time sensitive.
Right. Oh, that's such a good point. And this is what trips us up as well. So step one, we talked about, you file the paperwork at the courthouse. Then the courthouse accepts it. You know, if you don't fill in all the spaces the correct way, they'll bounce it back to you. Then you got to try again and file it again. So once you get it filed and the court accepts it, then you have 30 days and only 30 days to serve the other person. So, you know, if you lose track of Joe, or Joe refuses to accept the certified mail, you might lose that 30 days and have to start all over again. So that's frustrating. Again, when we're working with very low income people, we have a big problem with that, because unfortunately, folks who have very little income often have to move. So those timelines, like Lisa said, are really, really important. And next page, please. Okay, here we're talking about some money. And you know, in general, when I am on the phone with lawyer referral folks, I do explain that lawyers in Harrisburg charge anywhere from $200 to $400 an hour. Now, that's just an average. And then I usually add, My father passed away a few years ago, and I had to give the attorney $3,000 up front, and I paid the attorney $300 an hour. And I wasn't being ripped off. That's how much it cost. He didn't own a home. It wasn't a fancy divorce. Probated will. He passed away. The same with a divorce. As Lisa mentioned, if you need evaluations, so you might need, like, say you are self-employed, or your spouse owns a business, you have to have a business evaluation. You might need a custody evaluation. If you're going to argue about who has the child when, or all these can add to the complication, having a private investigator track down your spouse. And so you can really rack up a big bill. I think that there's a big, really high conflict. Think about those TV stars and whatnot. I'm sure they spend more than this on their divorces. But another option you can try is divorce mediation. There's also something called collaborative law, and just as ways to try to reduce the conflict. But remember, reducing the conflict also reduces the cost. It's really, that's really what makes it expensive. Also, the courthouse charges you for their services. I think the filing fee is $200 or $300, and all these numbers change, right? So it's always important to look and see. And
the fees also vary by county.
Oh, good.
Just so that you're aware, it varies by county.
Right. And I think this is the next page and our last page. So next page, please. There we go. Resources that you can use. I mentioned if you are low income, MidPenn Legal Services, you can check them out. And big shout out again to my wonderful interns for adding all the links on the chat. So if there's any links that you want, you can go to the chat and you'll see the links. Now you can contact MidPenn Legal Services. Here's another issue I run into with this. If you live in a McMansion or a big house, and you're going to be divorced and your house is worth $1 million, but you don't have any cash, well, you're not going to be able to call MidPenn and get a free attorney, because the value of the house is going to be considered. At the end of the divorce, you could offer to pay the attorney based on the sale of the house. So that's just something to keep in mind. Then the other thing is, if you're 60 or over, there's the Area Agency on Aging, whether Dauphin County or any county, provides free legal services through the Area Agency on Aging. And PA Law Help is really a nice resource for any legal problems. It has information about the laws, and it also has links to self-help forms. And again, I mentioned this at the beginning, but if you have any legal questions about divorce or other civil, not criminal, but civil law questions, then you can use the PA Free Legal Answers website, and the link is there. And again, it doesn't cost you anything. And we also posted, there's some special rules to help people who are victims of abuse or human trafficking and whatnot. And so I think this is some more recent information about that. So I think we, do you want to make any other comments? This was the end of our PowerPoint, Lisa, but.
No, I think we covered the basics of a divorce, recognizing that every divorce is different, right? There's no one divorce that looks the same. So all of the things that have been discussed today are the general things that you need to know when you're thinking about getting a divorce or possibly getting a divorce, or you're moving towards a separation. I think what you can take away from it is clearly that, there is a distinction between, a fault divorce and a no fault divorce, and no fault is easier and is less expensive, whereas the fault can tend to be more expensive. also just the understanding that, it's important that you always reach out to an attorney to really help guide you, unless it really is a simple no fault mutual consent divorce, in which you can do the self-help forms that have been provided in the links, and they can be filled out by yourself and you can go through that process. However, if you are ever unsure and or it gets beyond that simplistic divorce, you really should contact an attorney, because you could be inadvertently giving up your right to spousal support or alimony. It may have impacts on child custody. There are a lot of other things that you just want to consider, and to make sure that your rights are properly being taken care of. So I think we just want to make sure that you have that perspective. Cost varies by county. Pennsylvania has 67 counties. So in Pennsylvania alone, you would have to go to each particular county to figure out how to file the proper paperwork and what the filing fees are associated with that county. But overall, the process that was described is the general process for what you would need to do
Right.
for any divorce within Pennsylvania.
And you know what, Lisa, I'll add too, when we talk about no fault divorces, that's usually when there are no resources.
Correct.
You don't have money in the bank. There's no retirement accounts. Nobody was in the military. You don't own your home. You're renting somewhere. Very, very bare bones. I really want to emphasize, very bare bones. Because if
Correct.
money gets involved, you really do want to talk to a lawyer. Yeah. So Ashley, I think we can turn off the recording and take questions if anyone has questions.